unfold.
You know the image? It's almost mythical at this point, isn't it?
Oh, completely.
Christmas Day, 1914, no man's land. You picture it covered in snow, and there are British and German soldiers just putting down their rifles, shaking hands.
And playing football. Can't forget the football.
Right, the football match. It's become this ultimate heartwarming story from the Great War. This one moment of humanity in the middle of all that industrial slaughter.
And look, while that story is incredibly powerful, the reality of it, when you actually dig into the diaries and the letters that we've seen, it's so much more complex. And frankly, it's more important than just the folklore.
Okay, so that's what this deep dive is about then. We're not just here to retell the story.
No, not at all. This is more of a forensic examination of, well, a sociological anomaly. We need to look at why this massive spontaneous truce involving, something like 100,000 troops along the Western Front. Why was it even possible? Logistically, psychologically, how did this happen?
So our mission today is to move past the sentimentality.
Yeah.
To analyze the specific conditions, the atmosphere, the psychology, the logistics that all came together to allow this incredible act of, mass noncompliance.
Exactly. What was actually happening out there in no man's land?
Right.
And what was the reaction from high command? Because they were, to put it mildly, apoplectic. And the big question, the really critical one, why did this happen once on this huge scale and then never, ever again? The context is just everything here.
Yeah.
The paradox of it is stunning when you stop and think about it.
Mm-hmm.
This all happened less than 5 months into a war that would end up killing over 16 million people. So when you step back, you realize you're looking at the final flickering light of a completely dead idea.
What idea is that?
The 19th century idea of gentlemanly warfare. The war hadn't completely, devoured its own humanity yet. These soldiers were still, in some ways, operating under an old set of rules.
Rules of honor, things like that.
Rules of honor, the sanctity of Christmas. Rules that their generals were desperately and ruthlessly trying to stamp out to make way for total industrialized slaughter.
It's the last gentlemanly gasp before the machines completely took over.
Precisely. And to really understand the risk those men took and the depth of their shared humanity, we have to start where they were. We have to start in the mud.
To get the Christmas truce, you first have to understand just how grim December 1914 really was.
Yeah.
I mean, you have to remember the promise that everyone was sold.
Over by Christmas.
Yeah. On both sides. That early optimism, all that romantic propaganda in London and Berlin, it didn't just evaporate, it was drowned, literally drowned in the trenches of Flanders.
That whole initial phase of the war of movement, was over. The Germans sweep through Belgium, the Battle of the Marne, the race to the sea, where both sides were trying to outflank each other. That was all done.
It had ground to a halt.
Completely. By the end of November, the sources all confirmed the front had just ossified. It was a 475-mile continuous, static scar from the Swiss border to the sea. This wasn't a war of movement anymore. It was a war of attrition. You only moved forward by grinding the other man down, yard by bloody yard.
And that new reality, that static warfare, was defined by something that went beyond nationalism. I mean, the environmental misery.
Mm-hmm.
That's the thing that often gets overlooked, isn't it? The shared suffering of the environment became this strange practical bond between enemies. The mud was the real unifier.
That's the perfect way to put it. The early trenches weren't sophisticated at all. They were, as one soldier wrote, just scratches in the ground.
Right, not the concrete reinforced systems we see in pictures from 1917 or 1918.
Not even close. They had no proper drainage. So when the torrential rains hit in November and early December, which they did constantly, the Flanders clay just turned into this thick, viscous, waist-deep slurry.
Waist-deep mud. I mean, just try to imagine that. That constant wetness wasn't just uncomfortable, it was lethal.
Oh, absolutely. The primary sources are just filled with the horrific consequences. Widespread trench foot.
Which often led to amputation, right?
More often than not. Plus frostbite, dysentery, typhus, all of it running rampant. And the key thing here is the mud and the cold didn't discriminate.
It didn't care what helmet you were wearing.
Exactly. It didn't care if you wore a German pickelhaube or a British soft cap. The British Tommy and the German Fritz were equally miserable. They were fighting the mud and the rats more than they were fighting each other. And that shared physical struggle, that created the first psychological opening.
It's so unsettling to think that the enemy, in a weird way, becomes your co-sufferer against a much bigger environmental foe.
It is, and you combine that shared misery with the startling intimacy of the front lines in those early days.
This wasn't the vast, empty wasteland we think of from later battles.
No. In key sectors like around Armentières, or Plug Street, as the British called it, the opposing lines were as close as 30 to 50 yards apart.
30 to 50 yards. That's unbelievably close. It's less than a swimming pool length. That proximity must have created a sensory connection that you just don't get in modern warfare.
You couldn't escape it. The soldiers could hear the enemy coughing. They could hear the scrape of a shovel. They could smell their cooking. They saw their daily routines over and over again.
And that closeness, the sources show, it led to this unspoken agreement, what historians call it, the live and let live system.
The live and let live system. And this is the absolute crucial groundwork that was laid before Christmas. It was this unofficial local armistice born out of, sheer exhaustion and a desire for self-preservation.
So this wasn't just some random act of Christmas kindness. It was almost a rational local military strategy for survival. What were the actual rules of this system? They were very pragmatic.
Yeah.
The main rule was you don't fire during non-combat rituals.
Yeah.
Like breakfast.
Like breakfast, or when the other side was using the latrines. Crucially, you let the other side bring up their supplies at night or in the early morning fog. You'd see a supply wagon, you'd hear it, and you just choose not to fire.
What happened if someone broke the agreement? Say a new unit comes in that doesn't know the local rules.
Then you got instant heavy retaliation. If a British machine gunner decided to harass a German trench during mealtime, the Germans wouldn't start a huge battle. They'd wait. They'd wait until the British supply detail came up the line that night, and they would obliterate it.
It's a form of localized retaliatory justice.
Yeah.
A silent agreement backed up by the threat of firepower.
Exactly. It was a self-regulating system. And the pressure to conform came from the ordinary soldiers, the rank and file, because they had the most to lose. So the Christmas Truce wasn't this sudden, radical thing out of nowhere. It was a massive public amplification of a truce that was already happening every single day.
But surely the high command knew about this. If your soldiers are willing to make peace for breakfast, they're only a few steps away from just refusing to fight altogether.
Oh, but they knew. And we will definitely get to their reaction because they saw it as a catastrophic erosion of the offensive spirit. But in December 14, they just hadn't grasped how static and impossible the war had become. They were still planning cavalry charges while their men were literally stuck in the mud. The live and let live system was just local reality overriding an unrealistic, centralized doctrine.
Okay, so that system sets the stage. The shared misery, the unofficial truces. But something specific had to happen to make tens of thousands of men actually climb out of their trenches.
Yes, you needed a catalyst, a physical trigger. And that trigger was a very distinct, very sudden meteorological shift.
The weather. The primary sources are all remarkably consistent about the weather.
They are. On Christmas Eve, a sharp, hard frost fell across Flanders, and it did something that weeks of human effort couldn't. It froze the liquid mud solid.
It literally transformed the landscape of no man's land. Private Henry Williamson wrote about it, didn't he? He described it as a beautiful moonlit night, frost on the ground, white almost everywhere.
That's the one. And this physical change was critical. The ground, which had been this treacherous liquid bog, was now solid. It was walkable for the first time in weeks.
And it wasn't just the ground that changed. The sound changed, too.
That's a fantastic point. The acoustic change was hugely important. The freezing air carried sound with this crystal clarity. So the dull, constant thud of artillery, the plonk-plonk of sniper fire, it was all replaced by this profound, almost ghostly tranquility, as one soldier put it.
And it's in that silence, that crisp, clear air, that the truce really begins. Not with a gunshot, but with a cultural signal.
Yes, the famous Tannenbaum offensive.
Right, one of the strangest details in the entire story. The German high command, or at least civilian groups back home, had sent thousands of miniature Christmas trees to the front lines.
Tannenbaum. A tradition that's just so deeply German.
And the radical act wasn't just having the trees. It was what they did with them.
Exactly. On Christmas Eve, German soldiers started placing these little trees, decorated with lit candles along their parapets, all up and down the line. Rifleman Graham Williams wrote about seeing these little lights just appear one by one, burning steadily in the frosty air.
I mean, think about that. In a war defined by darkness and concealment, where the #1 rule is that any light is a target for a sniper, to deliberately light up your own position, That is an incredibly profound, almost reckless signal of non-aggression. It's an invitation.
It was the German side signaling a complete, if temporary, suspension of all the tactical rules. And that visual signal was immediately followed by an auditory one.
The singing. The singing. German soldiers began singing the most iconic Christmas carol there is, Stille Nacht, Heilige Nacht, Silent Night. And the British, of course, they recognized the melody and they started singing back. It turned into this huge impromptu sing-off across no man's land.
It did, but there was one specific cultural moment that really broke the barrier. Because singing at each other from 50 yards away is one thing.
Meeting face-to-face is a whole other level of trust.
Right. And that moment, according to the sources, was the hymn Ades Fidelis. The British started singing, "O Come All Ye Faithful," and then, astonishingly, the German lines joined in with them.
But they weren't singing in German or broken English.
No, they were singing the original Latin words.
Wow.
And that use of Latin was the definitive moment. It was a neutral, sacred language that transcended the national hatred. It completely bypassed the language barrier.
Because they all knew it from their own shared Catholic or Lutheran church traditions.
Exactly. It was this powerful reminder of their common European civilization. For a moment, the nationalist propaganda just melted away. They weren't targets in opposing uniforms anymore. They were fellow members of the same ancient civilization, acknowledging a shared history through a shared hymn. That emotional connection is what made that final, terrifying step out of the trench possible.
So Christmas morning arrives. The mud is frozen solid, the singing has died down, and now there are these tentative shouts across the wire. The sources say the first men to cross were overwhelmingly the rank and file, right? Not the officers.
Oh, absolutely. It was driven from the bottom up. And the first exchanges were all based on this simple pidgin English. Captain C.I. Stockwell wrote that he heard the Germans shouting, "Don't shoot. We don't want to fight today. We will send you some beer."
And the universal phrase was, "You know shoot, we know shoot."
That was it. That was the simple contract.
What's so fascinating is how, as soon as they met, the British soldiers started making these sociological distinctions. They didn't just see Germans.
No, they immediately started distinguishing between the Saxons and the Prussians.
Right. And this is vital for understanding how the British were able to rationalize this. They saw the Saxons as what? More amiable, like gentlemen.
Exactly. More relatable, less aggressive. The Prussians, on the other hand, they were stereotyped as the aggressive militaristic core of the Kaiser's regime. They were the real enemy. This taps into centuries of German history, where Prussia was seen as the dominant military state.
So by fraternizing with the Saxons, the British soldiers could tell themselves, we're not making peace with the enemy. We're making a temporary peace with the good Germans.
It's an intellectual loophole. It allows them to maintain the official idea of the enemy while indulging in this local truce. And we even have anecdotes of Saxons threatening to fire on Prussians who were shooting at a British burial party. So this local agreement even transcended their own unit loyalties.
And once those first handshakes happened, the truce was cemented by trade. No man's land turned into this temporary surreal marketplace.
Yes, the material economy of peace. And the things they exchanged were very specific. They addressed practical needs.
And the number one item, the most coveted currency, was the British Princess Mary Tan.
Hands down, those embossed brass tins with the tobacco and cigarettes, they were high-status currency. The Germans absolutely prized them as a souvenir and for the quality of the tobacco.
So what were the big trays? It was all about breaking the monotony of the rations, wasn't it?
Oh, completely. The British were sick of bully beef and plum pudding, so they'd trade that for German sausages, dark bread, and beer. The British Navy cut tobacco was considered superior, so that would be traded for German cigars or meerschaum pipes.
They even traded newspapers, so they could compare propaganda notes.
They did. And Henry Williamson, who we mentioned, he captured this feeling of communion perfectly. He wrote, "In my mouth is a pipe presented by the Princess Mary. In the pipe is German tobacco. Yes, a live German soldier from his own trench." That one image, smoking the enemy's tobacco in a souvenir pipe from your own royalty, it just shatters every taboo of military separation.
It does. But as important as all that was, we have to remember the grim, practical heart of the truce.
Burying the dead. Burying the dead. This wasn't just a Christmas party. No man's land was still littered with the frozen bodies of men killed weeks earlier. The ground was too hard, the fighting too intense to retrieve them, so the truce was the first chance they had to give these men some dignity.
And they did it together.
Side by side. British and German soldiers working together, digging graves in the iron-hard earth. Captain Walter Imlach of the Gordons described a joint service held right there in the field where they read Psalm 23, "The Lord is my shepherd."
And the most poignant detail of that account is the German soldier who was a divinity student.
Yes. He acted as an interpreter, translating the service word for word so both sides could participate in the mourning. They found common ground in shared grief. The irony of it all, as one soldier wrote, was just too ironical for words. Okay, so let's get to the most famous and maybe the most contested part of the story, the football match.
Right. The mythology has sort of painted this picture of a full 90-minute organized game with a referee and everything. And because that myth is so big, the skeptics often swing the other way and say no football was played at all. But the historical record is somewhere in the middle, isn't it?
It is. The record confirms a whole spectrum of activity. From just chaotic, improvised kickabouts to at least one semi-organized match that we can verify.
The consensus for most of the accounts is just a chaotic kickabout, right?
Mm-hmm.
I mean, the ground was a mess.
An absolute mess. Pockmarked with shell holes, crisscrossed with wire. It couldn't have a proper game. Ernie Williams of the Cheshires described it as a general kickabout with hundreds of men. He said, "The ball appeared from somewhere. There was no referee and no score. It was simply a melee."
And if they didn't have a real ball, they just improvised.
They used whatever they could find. A hard tin of bully beef, straw tied up with string, rags stuffed into a cap comforter. The human need to play just. It overwhelmed the conditions of the battlefield.
But let's get to the verified match, the one that gives us that definitive score.
Okay, so this is where it gets really interesting, because the most credible evidence for a real match with a recorded score comes from the German side, specifically from the 133rd Royal Saxon Regiment near Frelingen.
Lieutenant Johannes Niemann. What did he record in his memoir?
Niemann gives a really detailed account. He remembered a Scottish soldier appearing with a proper football, and he said a real football match got underway. He even detailed how they made the goals.
Right, they used their caps.
The Scots used their strange caps, so their Glengarries or bonnets to mark their goal, and the Germans used their caps for theirs.
And Niemann is the one who gives us the score. This is what elevates it from just an anecdote to a historical data point. He does. He wrote it down explicitly in his memoir. The game ended 3-2 for Fritz. The Germans won 3-2. But there's an even better detail in Niemann's account. Something that just adds this incredible layer of credibility, confirming he was really there, up close.
Yes. Niemann recorded the genuine amusement of the German soldiers when they saw the Scottish Highlanders' kilts flaring up while they were playing.
Revealing that they weren't wearing any undergarments.
Exactly. And that is such a specific personal observation, and it aligns perfectly with the uniform practices of those Highland regiments. It confirms this was a real close-quarters interaction.
It's amazing how those tiny human, almost funny details are what can verify a huge historical moment. And the wider feeling was captured by another German, Lieutenant 𝐏𝐻𝐃𝐂𝐂𝐓. He was a school teacher.
Zamish framed it philosophically. He described the whole thing as how marvelously wonderful, yet how strange it was. He saw the game and the truce as a celebration of love that just erased the enmity for a little while.
So the truce happens. The letters and photos start getting back home, and the news eventually filters up to the high command. Now, you'd think they would have been completely blindsided by this.
You would, but actually, no. And that's what's so fascinating. British command was already on high alert about fraternization.
Because of the live and let live system, they were already trying to stamp out.
Precisely. They saw the danger of static warfare. And this brings us back to that warning from General Smith-Dorrien.
Right. This was weeks before Christmas.
3 full weeks. December 5th, 1914. General Sir Horace Smith-Dorrien issued this incredibly prescient directive. He explicitly prohibited any friendly intercourse with the enemy. He threatened court-martial for any officer who allowed it.
He saw it coming. And his reasoning wasn't just about discipline, was it? It was about maintaining the psychological will to fight.
Smith-Dorrien understood that if soldiers saw the man across the field as a fellow human being, as someone you could share a song with, then the will to charge at him in a frontal assault would just collapse. The enemy had to remain an abstract, hateful thing, not a person.
So when the news of the huge Christmas truce did arrive, the reaction wasn't surprise. It was just pure fury. Apoplectic is the word used in the accounts. And technically, fraternization was treason, a capital offense. But here's the dilemma they faced. Punishment was impossible because of the scale of it.
The sheer scale. We're talking about nearly 2/3 of the entire British line. You can't court-martial 100,000 men without sparking a full-blown mutiny.
And on top of that, censorship wasn't absolute yet. The newspapers back home, like the Daily Mirror, were actually publishing photos of British and German soldiers shaking hands.
So the army was trapped. They couldn't punish men who were being celebrated as heroes by the public. They had to be very careful, dealing with officers quietly while publicly trying to downplay the whole thing.
And beyond morale, they were worried about intelligence too, right?
Yeah.
That the Germans were using the truce to scout their defenses.
Absolutely. The lines were so close. A German officer pretending to be friendly could easily gauge the depth of the wire or the placement of a machine gun nest. Captain Stockwell, the officer we mentioned earlier, noted that he refused to let any German officers see his actual trench for exactly that reason. All trading had to happen strictly in the middle of no man's land.
So they had to end the truce. But because it was a mutual agreement, they couldn't just order their men to start firing. It required negotiation.
A delicate negotiation. Captain Stockwell described this formal ceremony on Boxing Day morning to restart the war. He fired 3 shots into the air and raised a flag that said, "Merry Christmas."
And the German captain bowed, fired 2 shots, and that was it.
And as Stockwell put it, the war was on again.
But the sources show that the resumption was really reluctant.
Incredibly reluctant. In many places, soldiers were deliberately firing high over the heads of the other side. They'd shout messages like, "We have to fire now, keep your heads down." In the end, to really get the killing started again, commanders often had to bring in fresh units who hadn't been part of the truce, men who were, uncorrupted by the friendships they'd made.
So the 1914 truce terrified the authorities. They learned their lesson, and they made sure it would never, ever happen again on that scale. How did they do it? How did they dismantle the conditions that allowed it to happen?
It was a comprehensive, multi-layered effort, and it started with draconian new policies.
The rules changed immediately.
By December 1915, the orders were explicit and non-negotiable, immediate court-martial for any fraternization, and commanders were ordered to preemptively shell no man's land on Christmas Eve.
So they were literally ordered to fire artillery barrages to prevent soldiers from even hearing each other sing.
They used sheer firepower and noise to destroy any possible festive atmosphere. They deliberately drowned out Stillnacht.
And they made examples of people to make sure the message got through. The most chilling example was the 1915 court-martial of Captain 𝐏𝐻𝐃𝐂𝐀𝐒𝐓 of the Scots Guards. He was formally charged for allowing just a minor local truce. He only got a reprimand, probably because he had powerful friends, but the trial sent a clear message to every officer. Tolerance for this kind of humanity was over. And if the policy wasn't enough, the war itself just got so much more brutal in 1915. Any lingering ideas of gentlemanly conduct were destroyed.
The big turning point was the introduction of poison gas at Ypres in April 1915. Chemical warfare was this new, indiscriminate horror.
Once gas is on the battlefield, the enemy isn't a fellow sufferer in the mud anymore. He's the guy who uses this cowardly, terrifying weapon. It makes it so much easier to dehumanize him.
Infinitely easier. And beyond the battlefield, public opinion at home hardened dramatically.
Things like the sinking of the Lusitania, the Zeppelin raids on London.
Yeah.
It brought the war home to civilians. And the casualty list just kept growing from battles like Loos and then the Somme.
The live and let live mindset was just erased. By 1916, the soldiers arriving at the front had been thoroughly indoctrinated to hate a clearly defined, brutal, gassing enemy. The perfect storm of conditions from 1914, the frost, the carols, the innocence, it could never be replicated. The truce was literally legislated, bombed, and gassed out of existence.
So what's the big takeaway for us, for you, the listener, today? This deep dive shows the Christmas Truce wasn't a mutiny, it wasn't a pacifist movement, it was this pragmatic, spontaneous act of shared humanity.
And it was only possible because of a unique set of conditions that the generals realized, to their horror, allowed their soldiers to stop hating each other. It really was the last gasp of that 19th century ethos, where enemies could still recognize each other as gentlemen.
And when you go back to the letters, the shock of the soldiers themselves is still so powerful. Oswald Tilley wrote home saying, "Just you think that while you were eating your turkey, I was out talking and shaking hands with the very men I had been trying to kill a few hours before. It was astounding."
And 𝐏𝐻𝐃𝐂𝐀𝐒𝐓, the school teacher, he gave us the final word on it. He said, "Thus Christmas, the celebration of love, managed to bring mortal enemies together as friends for a time." So the key takeaway from our deep dive is this. The truce proved that the intense dehumanization you need for industrial warfare, It's a constructed thing. It's fragile. And it can be shattered by something as simple as a shared cigarette or a song. The specific details, that 3-2 football score for Fritz, the shared singing of a Desta Fidelis in Latin, they are such powerful symbols. They prove how easily the enemy is rehumanized when you allow for even a moment of simple connection.
And so you have to think about the systematic, deliberate effort it took for the high command to make sure those moments never happened again. They had to literally banish the frost with explosions and court-martial the compassion out of their officers.
So what does that tell you about the real cost of maintaining hatred? It tells you that the single greatest threat to a war effort might just be a simple shared act of humanity. And if the generals had to go to such lengths to banish that humanity to keep the war going, well, what subtle mechanisms are at work today in our own polarized world that actively prevent us from sharing a simple moment with those we've been told to consider the enemy? That's the uncomfortable truth the Christmas Truce leaves us with.